pretty unusual for me to be able to talk about a railroad that, at no point in its history ever entered bankruptcy. But in the case of Illinois Central, that is absolutely correct. Hello, welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains the main line of mid-America. Not really at all. And today, we're going to discuss the Illinois Central Railroad. I've gotten a few requests to talk about this, and I haven't talked about a fallen flag railroad in a while, so let's do it again! This is the story of the Illinois Central Railroad. In the 1830s, Illinois was looking to boost itself, because it was a fairly new state at the time, but it was seeing how railroads were benefiting states east of them, so it seemed reasonable to want railroads for themselves, and its population had more than tripled since they first achieved statehood. The first thing they did was pass the Internal Improvement Act in 1837, which meant that $10 million was set aside to construct 1,300 miles of railroad across the state. During that time, they were also looking at what was supposed to be called the Central Railroad, which was supposed to be a rail line that would link Cairo, the southern tip of Illinois, to Galena, which is near the Mississippi River. The route was supposed to cost $3.5 million, and though the project was seen necessary to this future of the state, things just didn't happen. No one was interested, at least for a while. So to push things along, a land grant bill was signed into law on September 20th, 1850. That provided a large amount of acres, 2.5 million actually, which were federal lands. Now, why would a railroad need that many acres? Well, they didn't. That wasn't really the point. The land was mostly sold off by the railroad, and they would take the money and use it to fund the construction. That might seem very generous of the state, but it wasn't as if they didn't also benefit. For one thing, they knew the economy needed the lines, but also, the railroad agreed to complete the proposed route within 6 years, as well as pay a small percentage of gross revenues to the state. So it was like an extra tax on top of it, but it was still a pretty good deal. On February 10th, 1851, Governor Augustus French finally signed into law the charter for the Illinois Central Railroad. Their original charter line spanned a total of 453 miles, and on top of that there was a planned branch that would continue north and reach Chicago, totaling 252 miles. I don't know how 252 miles is a branch line. Also, I find it laughable that their main line to Chicago was originally seen as a branch, but, times change. However, money became an issue pretty early on, because even with those land grants, the projected cost of this whole thing was $17 million, and that was a low estimation, as the final cost wound up being $26 million. They actually reached out to European capitalists, try to get some investments, but none of them were interested. Fortunately, they found some stateside investors, and the official groundbreaking of the railroad took place on December 23rd, 1851, in Chicago. Even though the Chicago was the largest city in the area, and at some point someone must have realized, actually, maybe this shouldn't be a branch line, because this is a really important hub for us. And yeah, it was, and they knew that. That's why they started there, because they wanted to start servicing Chicago almost immediately, as soon as they could. They constructed the lines mostly south, and the whole thing was ready for service on September 27th, 1856. It was actually a really impressive piece of engineering in its day. Not because of any grades, though. Out there, it's pretty flat. It's near the Great Plains, actually. So they didn't have to really worry about hills, like, at all. But the line was very long. There was nothing like it in the world at the time. Given Illinois was still growing, and the fact that they covered so much space, they didn't have any trouble generating profits. I mean, it was boom times for the railroads, and there was plenty of stuff to move. They were in a perfect spot. That area of the United States is very economically relevant. They had access to the Mississippi, the Great Lakes, eventually the Gulf of Mexico, and they were right near Chicago. There was farm produce to move, as well as coal. Coal would actually eventually rise to be 38% of their freight tonnage. And building around Chicago proved to be an excellent idea, since Chicago eventually became the railroad capital of America. There were a lot of railroads around them, which meant a lot of competition, but Illinois Central always trucked forward without much of an issue. They were always managed pretty well, and they knew when to expand. And by that I mean they pretty much expanded all the way through the 1800s, continually acquiring smaller, less profitable railroads to add to their own network. This series of acquisitions would last into the early 1900s, and by 1929, they reached what was considered their maximum network length in history, 6,721 miles. And they didn't get complacent with their success either. See, during the 1920s, when things were really good economically, instead of just pocketing all the extra money and assuming everything would be fine, they reinvested a lot of it to improve their own network. So when the Great Depression did happen, they were in a perfect position to wade through the hard times, which they did. They didn't enter bankruptcy during the Great Depression, which is not a sentence I get to say very often. And the World War II boom made them so busy that they actually struggled to keep up with demand. And while they were a little conservative in their approach to things, they did examine additional technologies on occasion. See, they were one of the earliest to experiment with diesel locomotives. They acquired their first box caps from General Electric Ingersoll Rand in 1929, as well as Illinois Central 121 for their Green Diamond passenger train in 1936. But at the same time, they were also really reluctant to get rid of their steam engines outright. They did not fully dieselize until 1961, though that was mostly because of their strong coal traffic. They didn't want to undermine their own customers, and diesels didn't use coal. Steam engines did. So much like Norfolk and Western, they kept steam around as long as reasonably possible. With the extra money they had from the World War II boom throughout the 1950s, while a lot of railroads were struggling, Illinois Central was updating. They added centralized traffic control, as well as heavier rails to accommodate larger and heavier trains, and they offered trailer-on-flat car service in 1955, another innovation that helped coexist with the booming truck market. Because again, it was the 50s. Planes and trucks were taking a lot of the railroad's customers. They needed to find a way to coexist with them if they were going to move forward, as all the rail lines did. And Illinois Central gave it a good honest try, but they still made some mistakes. See, in the 1960s, they came under the control of one William Johnson. Now, Johnson didn't have all bad ideas, but his focus was largely, well, split. For one thing, he decided to change their old-school livery around. Originally, they were just black and white. Very inoffensive that way, very basic. But he changed it to a much bolder and eye-catching orange and white scheme. Now, why would he want to do this? Well, to be fair, an eye-catching paint scheme is really good for brand recognition. The thing about rail lines, and trucks do this too, as do airways, is they always mark their vehicles with the company's name. It's literally free advertising. If your company has an eye-catching image, it's just easier for people to pick out and maybe want to use you. It keeps the corporate name in their heads. But it seemed like kind of a waste overall, and they didn't really fix any of their issues. In the 1960s, they were struggling financially, as most railroads were. But the major issue with Johnson is he really pushed for the idea of a shell company. Now, I've talked about this before, and that's because a lot of railroads in America did this right about this time. Everybody's doing it. All the popular kids are doing it. We gotta do it now. That was pretty much the plan. The way it worked was this. A railroad in itself, if they invested in another industry, there's a whole bunch of taxes and fees and things that the IRS has to know about. So, in order to get around a lot of this, you just make a holding company, which purely exists just to hold the other companies as subsidiaries, including the railroad itself. Then the holding company is free to invest capital into other, more profitable ventures or even other industries. In Illinois Central's case, well, their holding company was called Illinois Central Industries, which was formally launched in 1963. It wasn't Johnson's idea, but he was very much behind it. And they invested in everything from the American Brake Shoe Company to Pepsi. Now, seriously. And that did generate extra capital for them, but the problem with this is that, well, it doesn't really solve any problems at all. Yeah, it gives you more money, but only because those other industries are doing well. It doesn't actually fix any of the problems that the rail line was dealing with. It just helped delay things until you could figure out what was wrong. And Johnson himself never really figured out what was wrong with Illinois Central. None of his newer ideas really did much for them in the long term, or even in the short term. And he was noted as oddly focused on the holding company idea, which again is not a solution, it's just a band-aid on a broken arm. Like, yeah, maybe it'll make you mentally feel better, but it doesn't actually fix the problem. So once again, they looked at the popular kids, like fools, and decided to look at the other thing that everyone else was doing at the time. Say it with me. Merger! Oh yes, of course they did. Everybody's doing it! It's alright guys, it'll be fine, I promise. There's no time where it's ever gone wrong. I swear. In Illinois Central's case, they reached out to a historical rival of theirs, though they were smaller in size. Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio Railroad. They too were struggling under the situation, serving many of the same markets, and a merger can work out sometimes. When two companies merge, you're eliminating a competitor. You don't have to worry about them anymore because you're working together, for mutual benefit. However, there are a lot of things that can go wrong with a merger too. In Penn Central's case, for example, it was everything. And while the things that can go wrong vary depending on industry, one of the biggest problems that I noticed, duplicate infrastructure. Regardless of what the industry is, there's always some kind of overhead to cover. In a merger, you inflate that overhead. But if some of the overhead shares space or does the exact same thing, there's no need to duplicate it. There's no need to have more than it. So you wind up with a ton of redundancies, which generally in a company is considered a bad thing and a significant waste of money, increasing your expenses where that otherwise wouldn't happen. And for the company that would become Illinois Central Gulf, which is what they called themselves, ICG, these two companies had many lines that paralleled each other. Therefore, upon merging, the only benefit they gained was not having a competitor, and their overhead costs ballooned in size well beyond their profit margins. So if anything, the situation was worse when they did this. Yeah, sure, when they formally joined on August 10th, 1972, they created a 9,500-mile network, but if most of that network had duplicate routes, then what was the point? And that was kind of the problem. Their expenses well outpaced their earnings, and they were in danger of actually entering receivership for the first time in Illinois Central's history anyway, in the early 1980s. But they'd merged pretty late, and lasted a lot longer than the other mergers in America. So long that they survived until the 1980 Staggers Act. That act deregulated a ton of the industry, and made it so they didn't have to actually ask the ICC permission to remove unprofitable segments of their lines. And as a result, under Harry Bruce, Illinois Central Gulf started just hemorrhaging lines all over the place, selling or abandoning wherever they could. If it didn't make them money, it was gone. It was gone. Everything was gone. And eventually they reduced their network down to just 2,887 miles. That sounds bad because they occupy less space, but for them, it was good because it meant they had more efficient space. Every line they still retained made them money. And that was the goal. And it worked. Additionally, they started doing so well again that they spun off from the holding company entirely, no longer a subsidiary, independent again, on January 1st, 1989, and during that time they also dropped Gulf out of their name entirely, becoming just Illinois Central again. Because I'm not really sure why they did that. I guess they just didn't care about their original merge partner. Regardless, they had a third of their original mileage left, but they were earning huge profits. They kept reducing their operating ratios in order to maximize efficiency, and in a really weird move, actually started reacquiring former trackage, and those lines were starting to be profitable again. With the deregulation, it revitalized a lot of confidence in rail traffic in general. They could actually compete with trucks. In January of 1996, they actually bought out the Chicago Central and Pacific to regain access to Omaha, which was a pretty important line. Illinois Central's operation was pure strategy at this point. Everything they had lost and then everything they gained back was based on very specific calculated decision making, and it was working. They were doing really well, but that made them a really good target for the mega mergers. In the 90s, there were a lot of big mergers that generated monster railways that we still have in America, and North America, actually, because the rail line that was interested in Illinois Central was actually Canadian National. For Canadian National, Illinois Central presented the opportunity for them to finally reach the Gulf Coast. The Gulf of Mexico was a major economic hub. That would be huge for them if they could pull it off, and they did because, Canadian National had a lot of money. They indeed gave Illinois Central a lot of money to acquire them, and that deal was finalized in 1998. Canadian National took control of the lines on July 1st, 1999. Illinois Central was therefore gone. But their memory still lasts as a very successful company in general. Even through their hard times and a few mistakes, they still powered forward and wound up as one of the most profitable rail lines in America. So profitable that a larger company wanted them. Badly. Badly enough to throw a ginormous amount of money in their face. And isn't that the American dream? I mean, honestly. IC's lines remain an important part of Canadian National's overall network, and even a lot of their lines they sold remain active even now. On top of that, a lot of their locomotives, historical and otherwise, remain in preservation. So it could be argued that Illinois Central isn't a failure. Yeah, they're a fallen flag, but only because they became so good that someone else wanted them. And that's not really a failure in the free market. That's a success, if you ask me. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders: Sundude267, Orange Glass, Benjamin Owens, Pincer Kitsune 191-232, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life, Guy Anzac, A1, Arthur Roy, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Brian, Jack Carson's Rare Videos, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Lord Hoth 444, Alaric Jaspers, The Baxter, That Guy with the Beard, Mark Holding, Lock Kraken, Murder Drones Doll, 8person 723, DM Trouble Typhoon, Ohio Trucker 1, Hendrick Motorsports Fan 5, Alfonso Lapuche, Royal Hudson 2860, Icerfer 1405, Charles Kwiatkowski, and Dr. Racer 78. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.